sort of embarrassing for me to admit, but still, these days, I can sometimes get so caught up in my own world, in my own agenda, my own to-do list, that when I'm driving home, I can drive right past neighbors' houses and not be concerned about the spiritual well-being of people who live in them. I can go to a restaurant and be more concerned about the subject matter that we're going to discuss over lunch or the food than I am the people around me or those who serve me. And I just have to keep reminding myself it's all about people, and I have to increase my own awareness of the fact that I'm here to touch people, to love people, to try to point people to faith. And I'm probably not alone in this. There's probably others who have the similar awareness challenge. I think all of us as Christ followers have to ask ourselves the question, who are my neighbors? Who are these people that I work with? Do I care about them? Is my heart open to loving them, serving them, maybe discovering their story, and listening to promptings about pointing them to faith? I think we're all responsible for that. When I was just a little kid, my father introduced me to sailing and sailboat racing. And I mean, immediately from the first time I was on a race boat, I mean, it was like an adrenaline rush. And I wanted to do it more and more and more. And most of my junior high and senior high years in the summer, I was on that boat. When I'm on a boat and feel the motion and the breeze, and then you mix in some good friendships with that equation, and for me, that's as good as it gets. So that's your run line there, if you want to trim to it. About 15 years into the development of Willow Creek, I realized that I needed to do a little replenishing and recalibrating in the summertime due to some of the pressures of church work. And we rented a little cottage here in South Haven, Michigan, and I guess originally I thought, well, this is where I won't be known as a Christian and as a Christian leader, and I can just fly beneath the radar and stay real low key here. But what I was not anticipating was getting into sailboat racing and developing an entire network of relationships that were not church focused. These are people who would never really be able to attend our church because of the 3-hour time distance. Yet I could see God starting to stir and work in some of the lives of the people that I befriended and raced sailboats with in the town here. I'm just one of the guys who, you know, has found faith and try to spread that as naturally as possible in just normal recreational contexts.
Well, I was involved in a sailing team here in South Haven for quite a number of years, guys that I've sailed with competitively for quite some time. And all of a sudden I got a phone call out of the blue from Tommy saying that we were not going to sail our regular program and that we were going to sail with this pastor from Chicago. And I just about hit the floor. I kind of had made a comment to Tommy that I said, why would we be doing that? I can't believe that we'd be changing programs, and felt at that time that the fun meter was really going to go from like 11 to 2.
I remember the first time we went out to practice with this new sailing team, and I was being introduced to each of the guys. When I got to Dave Wright, they called him Super, or sometimes they'd call him Soup. And I thought it was a little strange until I discovered over the next few weeks, he was just a super guy.
When I first met Bill, I was really quite suspicious of what that relationship was going to be like. And I think I moved in a direction of kind of observation, kind of very standoffish.
Sort of the ringleader of this sailing crew that was formed around this racing program that I put together. It was a guy named Tommy, wildest guy on the crew, full of life and energy. And shortly after our time of sailing together, I mean maybe a season or two, Tommy got very interested in spiritual things and wound up really starting to read his Bible and doing some real spiritual seeking, and this freaked Dave Wright out.
I mean, he was a close friend, and we spent a little time getting in trouble. And so when he entered into a relationship with Bill, I was really concerned about our friendship changing, and was quite angry at times about that.
I'll never forget the time when, after one of our sailing regattas, where Tom had started to open up to the other guys that he was actually considering Christianity. Super Dave took me off to the side and said, "I want you to stop messing with Tommy's mind about this God stuff."
You know, it was customary for Tommy in the wintertime to take a little bit of time off, and Bill had asked him to take a team of folks from Willow Creek down to the British Virgin Islands to do a team building experience. Well, he was doing this now for about a month, and was coming back home, and met him on the jetway. And as we were coming down the ramp, he said, "Well, you're not going to believe what I did this week." And I said, "Well, what's that?" He goes, "Well, I became a Christian." And I just thought at that time that aliens had just taken my best friend.
And he thought Tom was going to wind up just really off the deep end. And I was not that concerned, because I saw the new work of Christ in Tom's life.
Well, I didn't grow up in the church. I did spend a little bit of time there as a child, and kind of rebelled against that experience. I found it to be quite boring. And then I had 2 other experiences as a teenager. These experiences really got quite strange. I had people putting their hands on me and praying for me, and it was just really quite uncomfortable.
I could tell that Dave was suspicious because I was a pastor. He had never really known a Christian well at that point in his life.
I did come to Christ before my husband did, and it was very important to me that he come to Christ. I never thought I'd get married. I wanted to do life together in entirety with David. And so what did that mean? That if he didn't have a relationship with Christ, this was all going to fall apart. And it was hard to watch David struggle with understanding what a relationship with Christ was and understanding what it meant to be a Christian when people would push things at him.
I saw something so valuable inside Dave, and I remember just saying to myself, this is going to be a long, slow walk. He's got to see a Christian kind of walk the walk. I never put a time span on it. I just said, this is a guy I'd like to be friends with, and let God do whatever God's going to do. I really wanted to make sure that it was God doing the work and me riding in the second position.
Before regatta, I was preparing my little area on the sailboat, and Bill would come up and just ask me how my week had gone, how Beth was, maybe what had gone on at work. I mean, the conversations never really moved towards faith or Christianity. And again, it was just so refreshing to me that he was concerned about me as an individual and what was going on in my life.
I think really trying to point someone in the direction of faith is usually the summation of a lot of little inputs along the way. I don't think it's the big 3-hour talk where you start with creation and end at the end of the Bible. I don't think it's a great big theological brain dump all at once.
I remember Bill giving me a copy of Case for Christ before it was ever even in print. And so in my travels around the country, on airplanes, I would pull that out and read a few pages. And I really needed that because I was so inquisitive about the science part of it.
I prayed for him constantly. I asked other people to pray for him. I left books around. I joined a Bible study. He'd ask me questions about what happened at the Bible study, and I'd get sneaky about it. If you're curious, why don't you come?
After a regatta, I'd say, Dave, I'm going to pray for you every day this week, that you'll have a great week, that you'll be aware of this God who loves you. But it was just a series of these little seeds that were planted, inputs that were done, that I think started to gain some momentum over time.
Well, there was a time Bill and I were having breakfast together in a small little restaurant, and he proceeded to draw out the bridge illustration and was just inquiring about where I was at. Was I way on the left side? Was I getting a little closer to accepting God in my life? And I said, Bill, geez, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm like in the next booth.
I was only trying to ascertain where he was. Was he just ready to trust Christ, or was he just a step or two behind where I thought he was? I drove away from the restaurant thinking, man, I thought it'd take a little while, but I might be in for a decade here. He's a hard nut, but he was honest, and that's what you always love about Dave. I'll never forget when Dave called me and said that his dad had suddenly died of a heart attack. And the timing of this in Dave's own process was very worrisome to me, because we had just been talking about the afterlife. We had been talking about the fact that real people spend eternity with God or without Him. And that was hard for Dave to kind of comprehend in and of itself.
I remember my aunt asking whether my father had said some type of prayer in his life, and that would indicate whether he was going to heaven or not. I remember being at my mother's house and just sitting on the floor and being on the phone with Bill and just trying to process some of these things.
But when it came to whether or not his dad was going to wind up in heaven or not, on the basis of his relationship with Christ, and not just on the basis of was he a good guy, because he was a good guy. Those were extremely sensitive conversations that I think wound up being pivotal in Dave's process. At about the 7-year mark, I had become such good friends with Dave, and our lives had intertwined around sailboat racing and friendship, and so I remember getting to a point where I said, I just can't imagine not being in heaven with this guy. And the thought was rolling around in my head, and as he was leaving our Christmas party one Christmas, the thought occurred to me, why don't I just tell him?
He just looked at me and he said, Soup, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to eternity without you.
You know, guys don't say those kinds of things to each other. It just came out of me, and I was like, well, that's how I feel. See ya.
I got in the car and I told Beth, I said, you're not going to believe what Bill just said to me. And it just came from a place of genuine friendship and love. I mean, that just really made an impact. I mean, I thought about that a lot over the next year. I remember the Christmas Eve service where I had dedicated my life to Christ, and I just finally had decided that it was not worth kind of fighting it anymore. I was just sitting there listening to some worship. I had all my questions answered, and I just really felt it was time for me to say yes.
And Dave turns to me just as I'm helping he and his wife Beth with their coats, and he says, oh, by the way, I'm good to go. And I looked at him, I thought, what do you mean you're good to go? Are you going home? Are you going to a hotel? Or I don't even understand what you're saying. And he had a little twinkle in his eye, and he says, like, I'm good to go, man. You got to understand. And then he kind of came out with it and said, I trusted Christ tonight in the service. And I remember what I said to him. I said, no way. I mean, I can't believe you did that. And he said, I thought you'd be happy. And I said, well, it's going to take me just a little while to digest that. And he said, well, you know, love you, and gave a hug. And then I don't think he had told his wife yet. He was going to tell her in the car on the drive home. But I remember going into my kitchen, and I got Len and my kids around me, and you know, they've been praying for Dave for 8 years. And I said, Super told me he's good to go. They're like, what does that mean? I said, I didn't know either. And I said, he trusted Christ tonight. And they all, it's like in a chorus, they were like, no way. I said, that's what I said, no way. And I called him the next morning, and we talked about it, and he was just as solid as a rock. He had his questions answered, his heart was ready, he made the decision, and he has never looked back. He has grown consistently, month by month, since that day.
You know, I remember the evening before I got baptized, I was kind of asking Bill about what I should expect that next day. And he looked at me and said, the only thing you need to know right now is the deeper the sin, the deeper the dunk. I stepped out in the water, and Bill, of course, gently grabbed me and proceeded to, like, dunk me so deep my head hit the bottom of the lake, my tennis shoes came out of the water.
We laugh about it till this day, but there's deep symbolic importance to it as well. I mean, Dave came from a pretty colorful past, and then I really wanted him to feel that he had been cleansed from head to toe. I wanted him to feel that complete sense of being washed through what Christ did. And when he came out of the water and threw his arms up in the air, that was pretty cool.
And so to this day, anytime I'm around Bill, I have a life jacket on if there's water close by.
Unfortunately, I think the tendency for Christ followers is that the longer you walk with God, the more your relational world is inhabited by other Christ followers. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just how it works. And even some statistics would indicate that if you've been a Christian 5, 10, 15 years, you barely cross paths anymore with someone who's far from God. You watch Christian television, listen to Christian radio, you go to Christian events, you're involved in church work, and pretty soon it's just the totality of your existence. And so I have always felt I have to get a bit more intentional about making sure that I have proximity to people who are far from God. And I still argue the case that one of the best ways to do that is to find what your recreational passion is and then try to pursue it in the context of a group of people who aren't filled with faith yet. And because then you have the unifying factor of the recreational passion that you all enjoy. And if the Holy Spirit is alive and well in you, over time, the Spirit's work in and through your life will probably open some doors to further spiritual conversations. Usually when I'm in the process of my everyday life and I'm looking at the people around my world, I think to myself, you know, I should be developing friendships. That's what I think Christ followers do. And in the context of developing friendships, I think I should probably, before I say what's on my mind, I should discover the stories of the people that I'm developing friendships with. I mean, their lives, their backgrounds, their pain, what they've been through matters. I mean, it matters to God, it ought to matter to me. And then all I want to do is discern what a next step would be. How can I contribute to their life? How can I add value? Not just spiritual value. How can I add practical value? How can I serve them in some way that would honor God and help them? I try to remind people who are serious about evangelism that even beneath the value of evangelism is the value of love. Radically accepting love. And you will not go wrong. Heaven will never be disappointed if the bottom line value is love. I think what Dave is doing with his life these days is like the ultimate irony. I mean, here's a guy who never went to church in his adult life, and he spends 40 or 50 hours every week trying to serve churches who are outreach-oriented and trying to reach guys like he was. And when I see him counseling pastors these days, I want to crack up laughing. Because this is a guy I had to drag out of party tents and just had a whole bunch of vivid memories with in his pre-Christian days, and how God's using him now is one of the great joys of my life.